Omar. I'm Yvonne Chia, your moderator. Much excited with the current themes of disruptive technology and ESG climate change. While I'm with the bank, I'm also on the board of a manufacturing company, an aluminium smelter. So I'm wearing both the hats of a financier as well as an industry player. Joining me today on the panel is Margie, the CEO of Thoughts in Gear, who is front and center in the ESG world, helping her clients in SME and the corporate sector doing the net zero journey. As well, we have from Indonesia, Sylvi Gani, the Director of Finance and Investment, PT Sarana, Multi-Infrastructure of Persero, who has also recently launched the Just Energy Transition Plan in Indonesia. And from London, Remi Fernandez of the UNPRI, the Principles of Responsible Investment. He is a specialist in human rights and social issues. I think I will frame Just Transition as with industries in transition to a low-carbon economy. It is a set of principles, processes, and practices that build economic change to a green, regenerative, circular economy from where we are today. Decent work, green jobs, food, climate change, reskilling are buzzwords associated with just transition. But it is centered on people, transitioning and greening the economy in a way that is fair and inclusive as possible to everyone concerned. Policies and change has to be positive to create more jobs and social justice. When we are resetting the old ways of business with a new sustainability world, the role of banks and financial institutions stands up very clearly as a lever to move the economy. Transition pathways can run into various negative social impact, with the loss of jobs, dislocation of homes, and even civil unrest. The UN SDG are a universal call to action to end poverty, protect the planet, and ensure that all people enjoy peace and prosperity. Embedding the SDGs in transition finance, therefore, becomes critical. ASEAN, as a union of 10 member states, have committed themselves to take actions to deliver the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. Let me share a framework on the ASEAN state of affairs today. Increasing population growth plus the migration to urban areas and cities, increased consumption as well as consumerism poses major challenges as the countries continue to develop. Energy demand is increasing. ASEAN is the world's largest energy consumer. The current structure is skewed towards traditional forms of power generation with fossil fuels. And ASEAN is home to 85% of palm oil trade in the world, beset with accusations of poor labor rights, deforestation, and food safety standards. So you will see the first slide. The first slide shows the challenge of divide in existing development of ASEAN member states. ASEAN has a member state in Laos with a $2,500 per capita GDP versus Singapore with over $75,000 per capita GDP. The second slide on the state of the SDGs in relation to the achievement of the SDGs at the onset of the pandemic, global health crisis in 2020. Now, this gives an overall good idea of the materiality risk collectively in ASEAN. ASEAN is a collaborative union. It has adopted numerous frameworks with regards to climate change and ESG. The governments in each member state have drawn out their perspective. their respective approach with the whole of government and the private sector, and with their respective financing journey via their respective central banks as key arbiter on finance, on the journey to their respective net zero, ranging from years 2050 to 2060. Banks, for example, like Standard Chartered Bank, with a presence in over 59 emerging markets, including ASEAN, aims to be amongst the world's most sustainable bank. It has announced $300 billion in green and transition finance to help the clients reach their net zero journey. How then can the banks, venture capitalists, PE, and the greater financing community deploy funds and allocate capital to be a force for good in this transition journey? Ladies and gentlemen, with this as a background, let us hear from our first speaker, Margie Ong. Over to you, Margie.
Thank you very much, Dr. Yvonne. And with that excellent opening, it brings us to a very, very clear indication that climate change is much more than an environmental crisis. It is a social crisis that forces us to address numerous inequalities. Inequities between rich and poor countries in the world, inequities between rich and poor communities within the countries, between men and women, and between generations as well. Against this backdrop, we see that globally, geographically, the World Bank has found that climate change impact is closely intertwined with global patterns of inequity that encompasses health effects, food, water, and livelihood securities, migration, and of course, forced displacement that we've seen around the world today. For each locality, certain groups are particularly vulnerable, largely tied to socioeconomic status, gender, and other marginalized groups like Indigenous folks and persons with disabilities. In fact, measures to actually counter the climate crisis, like, for example, switching to electric vehicles for public transportation, or introducing carbon pricing and carbon tax, all of which we are definitely pushing for towards a low carbon economy, will in fact unjustly impact the most vulnerable in a community. Along those lines, my second point leads us to the highlight of COP27, the Loss and Damage Fund. Although we are all optimistic, we are still unsure what that means, and hopefully the 24 countries who are working on it this year will be able to give us some clarity in terms of the tools that they will be employing and how that will be dispersed. As an example, we all know that Pakistan, very unfortunately, had the huge floods recently, and they've incurred a total of $30 billion in damages and losses, whilst contributing less than 1% towards global emissions. This inequity stands today, and we have hope that it will, in fact, be addressed in, hopefully, this coming year in 2023. My third point is on global supply chains. And as we know, global supply chains at the moment are being disrupted. More than 78% of multinational companies around the world have declared that they will take drastic action if their suppliers do not meet their own net zero goals. Because as we know, they make up the scope 3 of large companies. Now, of all the global export revenue at risk, ASEAN countries make up 4 of the top 10 global export revenues at risk. Now, besides the companies involved, we can imagine that this involves employees, families, communities, and their livelihoods at risk as well. And this brings us to my fourth and final point, which is our community of financial institutions today. Financial institutions have to ensure that net zero plans within the financial institutions, as well as within your financed emissions, actually reflect some of the social impact, steps that will be taken within these net zero goals to account for the impact on people behind these companies in terms of workers and suppliers and communities, as well as consumers around the world that will be impacted. So what can financial institutions do? And before I hand over, allow me to just highlight 4 very high-level points and components that financial institutions can very quickly take today, alongside the multiple frameworks that we have, including whether it's GRI or SASB or TCFD or SBTIs. There is a framework called the Glasgow Financial Alliance for Net Zero, which have attributed 4 key financing strategies specifically for financial institutions around the world. The first is governance. So truly ensuring a set of structure to oversee, incentivize, and support the implementation of net zero plans alongside environmental and social impact implications. The second is a very clear implementation strategy that aligns business activities, products, services, and detailed policies with net zero environmental and social objectives. Thirdly, engagement strategies. So ensuring that we're not setting these plans in isolation, but engaging with external stakeholders in support of these net zero objectives. And finally, and sometimes most importantly, metrics and targets. Metrics and targets that help us assess, monitor, evaluate progress towards these net zero objectives and the actual impact progression that we have within the environmental and social arenas. And with this, I'd like to hand back to Dr. Yvonne in terms of really being able to progress the conversation. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Margie. Indeed, there are a lot of challenges. Our next speaker, representing the largest economy from ASEAN, Indonesia, is Sylvi Gani, who will share her insights on the role of government in transition finance, and especially playing a very important role in the ASEAN collaborative frameworks through the ASEAN Secretariat. Over to you, Sylvi.
Thank you, Dr. Yvonne. Can I have my slide to be shared?
Yes, please.
Okay, next page, please. Thank you. So I'll start with the a little bit background on what SMI is for those who are not familiar with SMI. But SMI is considered as a non-bank financial institution or the only special mission vehicle of the Indonesia government, wholly owned by Ministry of Finance. So we carry the mandate as the leading catalyst in the acceleration of infrastructure development in Indonesia. Next page, please. So this part of the our business that we provide financing and also investment advisory services for public financing, financing the municipal and local government, as well as financing the private sector. Next page, please. So the role of PTSMI in climate change is that we supporting the government program in solving the climate change in Indonesia, because Indonesia is very vulnerable on the climate change effect, because most of the population living in the coastal area that will be severely impacted by the climate change. So in fact, that the role that we carry actually coming from the government agenda on the climate change, that we have established the sustainable financing division that focus on the sustainable finance, mostly to the green project. We also one of the accredited entity in Southeast Asia from Green Climate Funds. SMI also established the platform together with the government, SDG Indonesia 1, where the all the parties that interest in the SDG coming together, providing the blended finance. We also has issued the green bond and in 2017, and that's why then every year we issued like a green bond and impact report. We have implemented environmental and social safeguard for every financing and investment decision. During the G20 last year, we have been appointed by the government as a country platform for energy transition mechanism. And the last but not least, we have established just recently SMI Institute as the think tank to help and supporting the government development program. Next page, please. So we are very serious in the implementation of ESG in financing and investment decision in our business. The importance of ESG, especially in infrastructure project, is we want to have the project that is sustainable. So ESG risk is one of the risks that we have to identify and also to understand and mitigate because we want this development actually has an impact for the sustainable development. And we want this project is infrastructure project to be sustainable. Next page, please. And one of the assessment that we carried during the financing investment decision that we have implement what we call it the environmental and social safeguard. It consists of the 10 key factors of environmental and social, not far from what international practice like IFC standard and also the World Bank, which actually put attention on how the impact of the project or financing to the environmental and the social. Next page. And the effort of PTSMI to achieve the net zero is to providing financing for the green project in the public sector as well as the private sector, helping the government to prepare and project under the advisory business. We have the SDG Indonesia 1 as a blended finance to provide development facility, the risking facility, and as well as the financing facility. And the last, given that the task and the assignment that government of Indonesia given to us as to take a role in the energy transition. So we currently established the framework for the energy transition mechanism. Next page, please. Okay. So under the ETM or Energy Transition Mechanism Country Platform, we have a task assigned by the government to coordinate with the stakeholders to develop the framework of energy transition in the electricity sector. We're conducting a comprehensive studies regarding the fiscal support needed for the energy transition, as well as the overall financing needed to achieve the net zero. This is include how we actually invite or mobilize the financing, not only from the local financing, but also from the non-state budget financing. So the output expected from this country platform would be the financing modality that needed to achieve the net zero, and also then how this fund is mobilized. Next page. So this is how the blended finance will work. So the source of fund coming from the government as a fiscal support, also from the philanthropy, multilateral, international partner. The country platform will be supervised by the steering committee under the government of Indonesia. Then this the funding will be mobilized to the player in the energy sector, which is the National Electricity Company, PLN, and IPP for the private player. Next page. So we are aware that the energy transition undertaken by the government now might have an impact to the social and to the environment, where the energy itself. Then we want to make sure that the impact will be minimized. So that's why we currently working together with the government and the ADB in this case to establish what we call it the just transition concept. The transition that will have the very minimal impact to the environmental and social. So the key policy area is being established not only to the environment but also to the social, to the labor, and to also the industry that related to the energy transition. Next page, please. So we have still more homework to do in regards to the energy transition, that we have to find the fundraising opportunity. We need to work together with the government as well to establish the carbon market framework. And last but not least, to help the government of Indonesia in the transition taxonomy, so we can invite more private sector to participate in this energy transition. Next. So that's the end of my presentation. I'll hand over this to Dr. Yvonne.
Yes, thanks. Thank you, Sylvi. Wow, I have to say, you have got heavy shoulders to carry indeed, you know. It's a vast responsibility and on so many levers for you to have it to coordinate. Yeah, and with that, I think it'd be nice to hear from a UN perspective and over from London, Remi, the insights of what you think a decent work and living wage is, and the social dialogues that are ongoing today. Over to you, Remi.
Thank you very much, Yvonne. And I think, you know, just the call to action at the beginning is clear. And, you know, it's sort of, we understand the case for just transition, and now it's sort of the time to act. And I think from an investor perspective, and what the conversations are at the PRI is really looking at how do we address this sort of climate and social nexus. And I think investors play a really key role in driving a just transition and can ultimately help to accelerate and optimize climate efforts. So looking more sort of at that tangible aspect, so incorporating just transition into investment strategy, investors can accelerate it through the different levers available to them. So looking at things such as capital allocation and stewardship. So there are several drivers prompting this, and I think my other panelists really outlined the case quite clearly. But sort of looking at the broader picture, there's a recognition of value drivers in investment opportunities such as transition finance and green markets, and then also at the same time increased risks of failure to act. So this could be through the impact of carbon pricing, growing unemployment in certain sectors, decreased asset value, as well as abandonment. So I think although there's been some encouraging development with regards to the integration of just transition, there needs to be significantly more uptake. So for instance, we need to see a greater amount of net zero commitments incorporating a social component. Otherwise, what we risk doing is exacerbating these pre-existing social issues through the transition. So such issues include, and are not limited to, informal work, forced labor, modern slavery, and child labor, which if we don't incorporate those into our commitments, we just risk sort of making these problems much larger once we sort of transition out of high carbon. And following on from that point, there's been a lot of focus on the transition out. With interim investor net zero targets on the horizon, investors are facing increased pressure to accelerate their plans and focusing on decarbonizing portfolios. In other words, transitioning out of a high carbon economy. However, with that in mind, I think it's really crucial to think about what we're actually transitioning into. And so what's important here is when we're talking about transitioning into green jobs, these green jobs need to be decent jobs. And just picking up on the points in the question, Yvonne, is decent jobs, what that means is jobs that have minimum safeguards. So in our decent work paper, these minimum safeguards are a living wage, access to health, safety benefits, and social security. And this is social security that exists beyond the ILO Core Convention on Social Security and the related conventions on it, as well as equal opportunity and treatment. And then fundamentally, freedom of association and social dialogue, which forms a really sort of key underpinning factor that can help shape what a living wage is and what these sort of benefits are. So that's sort of quite a large sort of overview. So hopefully that sort of does justice in terms of what the investor case is. So back to you, Yvonne.
Yes. Wow. Anyway, as I see where the world of the SDG is going today, there's so much moving parts, from the Ukraine war to the recent bank crisis in the US. A lot of these moving parts, I do not know to what extent they will affect the journey that we have in front of us. That was 3 very good insights from all of you. And I thought, let me ask the first question in listening to you. Margie, can I just start with this? You go on with the SMEs most of the time as well, right? And as well as corporates as well. What are the kind of conversations that's ongoing? And what kind of challenges, especially in the supply chain, that you see as you go around with them to assist them in the net zero journey?
Excellent question, Yvonne. And I truly wish that we were having these conversations. But unfortunately, I must say, to be honest, as much as I am thoroughly enjoying our conversation today and with this amazing participants here today, I feel oftentimes that we have these conversations in a bubble. And oftentimes when we actually engage with corporates and SMEs, we find that the business communities we speak to do not care enough, and they do not care enough, not just for the community and not just for the impact that they create. We are not idealists, and we don't expect everyone to come to the table for all the right reasons, but I think they don't care enough for their own businesses, to be honest, because of the risks and the opportunities that are actually are not yet made apparent enough for them. And unless they are exposed to global markets at the moment, they currently do not have enough motivation, be it the sticks or the carrots by the government, to actually be able to care. And to be fair, I do understand that many of them are in fact financially recovering from the pandemic. But I think what they don't realize, and which my panelist has alluded to as well, is that it will soon be very expensive to be unsustainable. And I think that's what currently is not being made well aware. Thanks, Yvonne.
I can imagine that, in the real world. I think my next question to Sylvi is, Sylvi, when you looked at the move by the Indonesian government to their new capital, the motivation behind that and the challenges behind that, how do you go about to influence that decision with science-based kind of data in that decision itself to the new capital of Indonesia?
Okay, I think the motivation is to actually to have the more equal development all over Indonesia. As we know that the development is centered into the Java Island and the Sumatra Island. If you look at how these 2 islands contributed to the GDP, it contributes around 70% of the GDP. So everything, especially in Jakarta, is centered into the Jakarta. Jakarta has the problem. So we're going to sink if we don't solve this problem, right? So that's why we need the new capital city actually to make it this development is more even. The challenge that we have in this development that, yes, we do the time constraint because we're going to have the election next year. And the very ambitious target by the President of Indonesia to have the ceremony of Independence Day by August next year. So that's one of the challenges of development. And the second challenge that we have the limited fiscal financing on this new capital city. So we need to mobilize the private funding into this development of the new capital city. And while the regulation and policy now is being established, that will give the incentive to the investors. So we expect that the more and more private sector to be able to participate in the development of the new capital city.
Thank you, Sylvi. Actually, Remi, my question to you is this, in ASEAN states, a lot of them are trying to survive. The industries are trying to survive. It'd be nice to hear from you. What's the state of your thinking or UN's thinking of the progress in ASEAN on these SDGs in particular to do with decent wage and to living standards? As you say, we are trying to eradicate poverty, a certain level of living income that is reasonable. So what is the state of the ASEAN states relative to the other countries that you are also supervising?
That's a great question. And Margie sort of alluded to this beforehand. I think if we sort of do an overview of ASEAN states and thinking about what is sort of the state of the labor market, we think about urbanization, demographic change, and new opportunities presented by globalization. So what's happened with that is it's created a really complex labor market in the region. So this is sort of characterized by high incidences of informal work, as well as persistent challenges around migrant work. And I think when we think about migrant work, oftentimes we can think about things such as FIFA, for instance, where you have a lot of migrant workers that are going into sort of being forced into situations where they're basically in living poverty. And so we're in sort of I mentioned this in the first question, but when it comes to the just transition, I think it's so important to be focusing on these pre-existing issues, because what we risk doing is exacerbating them, and particularly in a context such as ASEAN, where investors really need to pay attention on what are these issues at the moment and how can we address them and incorporate them in our climate efforts as well. And one final point I want to make around that is particularly looking at upcoming regulation in the European Union, such as corporate sustainability due diligence. This is going to be placing increased pressure on investors to carry out due diligence, and then also think about when they identify salient human rights risks, how do they go about addressing them and mitigating them? So it's a large task ahead, but the business case is clear and regulation is now catching up. So basically the time to act is now.
Good. I think I have time for one last question before I wrap up. And I think this question I can pose to both Margie and Sylvi, both from a perspective of the private sector SMEs and from the government. Now, one of the greatest challenges is the challenge of data, of collecting local data that will be needed and to be planned for science-based actions in the respective net journeys. I can imagine the challenge. Sylvi, you want to start that first, or Margie, any one of you?
Okay, yes, we do aware of that challenge. Until now we have also that kind of problems, that getting the information and data is not easy. It's not simple. We are busy with the day-to-day work. Then sometimes we forget on how we actually has to get the information. So that's why one of the initiatives that actually this is encouraged by the MOF for SMI to establish the SMI Institute. This institute actually will focus on doing the research. Then that's how they will get all the data and information needed to support the development in every aspect. So, okay, back to you, Yvonne.
Yeah, Margie, you want to say something before I closed?
Yes, please. Dr. Yvonne, you could not have touched upon a bigger issue in the world of global supply chains today. And just in short, the fact that the issue of data, both the visibility, the transparency, and in fact, the actual real data gathering on the ground as well, is probably one of the biggest issues we face in terms of being able to address both the environmental and social issues as well. When we talk about targets and 2050 net zeros, it all comes down to baselining as well. And even the baseline at the moment, in terms of being able to secure data for that, is very hard, especially in ASEAN. I just spoke to folks from Scandinavia, and they're down to tier 3 supplier data. And I think we really have to ramp up our efforts around data in the supply chain. Thank you.
Yes, indeed, indeed. So I think it's now time to close it. Let me give a very quick closing remarks here. In particular, I think the ASEAN states are good partners. They collaborate well, and they all know that they uphold the principles of equity within the ASEAN dialogue that we have. But each one of them have different national circumstances. So you will see that there will be a bit of differentiation in the way they approach. That's where we see the ASEAN going forward. But it is also very clear that the banks, as they channel their financing in the transition journey, we, the financiers, can shape the behavior and the actions, and therefore can have different impact for society and the environment. So money and the allocation of capital, when aligned with actions to impact societal good, indeed can be a force for good. But never underestimate the challenges that is ahead of us as we transform the economy and lives. And if we don't properly manage it, we can cause serious divide and even social unrest. But I'm confident, in listening to all the speakers today, that though they acknowledge the challenges, there is optimism as well. That when responsible players decide to embed SDG values, good conduct, and look beyond pure profit per se, they will attract the financing and the capital, and they will be the future winners. And from a financier's point of view, I would say that I'm confident that in the years ahead to 2030, sustainable finance will be the norm. With that, I want to thank everyone and each of you today for your excellent insights, and for GEFI to give us the platform to showcase some of the challenges on ESG, on just transition for ASEAN. And with that, I hand over to you, Omar. Thank you very much.